In Daniel chapter 10, the prophet finds himself beside the Hiddekel River. Mighty Tigris maybe is not to be compared to this little stream, but it seemed appropriate to film here by this little stream Daniel's great vision. For in verse 8, Daniel says that this vision was his great vision. And it begins by Daniel fasting. He's fasting for 21 days, fasting and praying, and this is in the first month of the year. In the first month of the year, that's Passover time, a time for celebration and for feasting. But instead, Daniel is in the attitude of the Day of Atonement, in fasting and prayer, like in the 7th month. And this goes on until he comes there by the Hiddekel River and lifts his eyes, the eye of faith. He lifts his eyes to heaven, and this is what he sees, according to verses 5 and 6 of Daniel 10. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man, clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. His body also was like beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a great multitude. And then it goes on to say that the friends that were with him, they ran in fear to hide themselves, just like in Revelation 6 it says that those that aren't hid in Christ will run to hide themselves when God's army comes to penetrate every life. And this vision that Daniel had is called the Great Vision. That means that Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, that Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 4, that Daniel's night vision in chapter 7, that Daniel's vision of the he-goat and the ram in chapter 8 are all minor compared to this vision. And yet this vision is only found in 2 verses, verses 5 and 6 of chapter 10. And why is it the great vision? Because it's a picture of a certain man. And that certain man is described in the same way in the first chapter of Revelation. It is Jesus Christ. And here he's dressed in fine linen, the garb of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Not only is he dressed in fine linen, but he has around his waist a sash of gold. The fine linen tells us that he's the high priest on the Day of Atonement. The gold tells us that he has a perfect life, a sinless character, a sinless nature. And then it says that his body was like beryl. If you turn to Ezekiel chapter 10 and verse 9, you'll see that beryl is a picture of the wheels of God's chariot. That means it can move. And so this man, this certain man, clothed in linen with a sash of gold, can move. He can move into any life. Just like the scroll in Zechariah 5, he can penetrate through the windows into every life, into every house, like Joel's armory in chapter 1 of Joel that goes and penetrates every house and doesn't lose step. This is a picture of a movable Christ, a Christ who can move into every life. And not only that, but it says that his face was like lightning. That means there's nothing hid from him. As far as the east is from the west, everything is visible to him, and his eyes, it says, are like lamps of fire. That means when he enters your life, he can penetrate even to the motives. This is a Day of Atonement, high priest picture. And this is the big bang of chapter 2. The stone cut out without hands is Jesus Christ. In chapter 7, the king that receives the crown in the investigative judgment is Jesus Christ. And in chapters 8 and 9, Jesus is the high priest that cleanses the sanctuary. So this picture, this great vision, is the big bang in every chapter, as well as it is in chapter 11, when 12, where it says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. So we're in university level now. We've had our primary school where we learned certain principles. We've had secondary school. We've had college. And now we're into the university level studies. And here we must grasp, in order to be prepared for life, to understand what is the Big Bang, what is the crisis that every one of us will face. And that crisis, if we lift our eye of faith and enter heaven's most holy place, we will enter the judgment and the cleansing of the sanctuary where Christ stands and he penetrates every life and he can see every motive and every action. And the books are open and our life record is there before him. What hope do we have? Our only hope is in the mercy of God. And our only defense is prayer. And so, when Daniel lifted his eyes, the eye of faith, it says that the man's feet and arms were polished brass. That tells us that he was a human being, that he lived on earth as a human being, and that polished brass that represents the outer court of the sanctuary is a picture of him knowing what it is to live as a human being, yet to live perfectly without sin. So when he comes to your name in judgment, what hope do you have? Well, the last phrase of that vision is, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. That means he speaks. He speaks for those who are found in him. If your name is written in his book of life, in his perfect life, if you are counted as one of his, he will speak for you, and he speaks words of peace and comfort. Daniel fell flat on his face. He lost his breath. He was entirely devastated, just like Isaiah when he saw in the sanctuary God appeared to him. He said, "Woe is me, for I am a sinner. I'm undone." And so Daniel says, I'm corrupt. And we must too confess when we come to judgment that we are corrupt, that we are clothed in filthy garments, and that our only hope is in the righteousness of Christ, our substitute and surety. So Daniel is comforted by Gabriel and by Jesus Christ, who comes as Michael, the great prince. And Michael comes and comforts him, and the angel Gabriel comes and encourages him and tells him, I'm come, in verse 14, to tell you about the deliverance of your people. And so this chapter begins with a vision, and it mentions a thing, a certain thing. That certain thing is chapters 11 and 12. Then Daniel understood the thing, and he had understanding of the vision. And if we understand the vision, we will understand the Big Bang in every prophecy of Daniel, and we will then, through chapters 11 and 12, see more detailed events showing the history of God's people in the midst of the tribulations of this earth.